The gallery started in 1963, but Dad had never met Husain, and the inaugural show was a group show which had several artists, Almelkar, Badri, Sabawala, Ara, but there was no Husain in that. From what I heard from my father, one day around 1964, which is almost a year after opening the gallery, he was on a little stepladder adjusting the spotlights when suddenly somebody started giving him directions from behind. And later when he turned around, there was this bearded figure that he recognized as Husain, though they'd never met. And that's how their friendship actually began. A few weeks later, he drove up in a taxi, took out 4 paintings, brought them into the gallery. They must have been reasonably small format, couldn't have been very large. And he told my dad, I will see you 24 hours later. So Dad was under huge pressure. So he called up a few clients that he knew, one of which I know was Rhoda Bear Soni, who was that time in charge of the decor for the Taj. And she was quite instrumental in goading my dad into opening the gallery. So I don't know who were the 3 buyers, but he sold 3 paintings. And then Husain didn't show up for about 4 or 5 days. Post that, he came with a taxi and said, put the paintings back in. And my dad said, but there is nothing to put in. So he said, what do you mean? So he said, look, I'll be very honest with you. Commissions were 25%. So he said, I've sold 3 and I'm keeping the 4th. And I think that took Husain also quite by surprise. He hadn't expected. I think he came there expecting to collect all 4 works. And I think that's where he felt a certain sense of confidence in my dad. So one of my first memories of Husain or interacting with him was probably as a 7-8-year-old. And my father took me on his scooter to his studio at Bombay Central. Dad and he had some conversation. And once finished, somehow Dad decided that Husain was driving back the same way. So he suggested Husain drop me to the gallery. That took me completely by surprise. I didn't know. I found it very, very awkward. But anyway, we both sat in his black Ambassador. I clearly remember that. And we drove. And I promise you, from the time I sat in the car at Bombay Central to the time he dropped me off on the side of the curb, just outside Fountain, outside the gallery, we hadn't exchanged a single word. I think he was as uncomfortable as I was. And I just said, thank you, uncle, got out the car and ran into the gallery. That's what I remember. There was a time in the 70s that he had painted over his Ambassador car. And there were these very energetically drawn horses, nudes all over the car. And when he used to go abroad on longer trips, very often he would leave the car with my dad. There were 2 reasons for it. One, he wanted the battery kept charged from time to time. And it kept his kids away from using the car, which I thought was unfair now when I think of it. So every 4 or 5 days, Dad would take the Ambassador to work. And after a point, he came to fetch me every day at lunch at Campion School, and then he'd drop me back and go back to work. And whenever he had this car, I'd given him a kind of a thing, give me a heads up in the morning, because standing outside school and him driving past made it very awkward for me to explain to, fellow students, what was this car all about? So we made a deal that I would go and stand 4 buildings away. He'd stop there to fetch me. Husain had no studio of his own or that he could call his own. He would paint anywhere. And that tradition goes back with him from the time that he actually lived on the streets in Mumbai. And he painted cinema hoardings. And not having the space, he had a window between 12 midnight and 5 a.m. when the trams would stop. And he'd do these large works on the road under street light, and he had to finish them off before 5. Or stop it at a stage where he could, fold it all up. And that had got him used to working in any environment. He invariably used the gallery as a studio space because he had a large family. He did paint at home, but I guess for him it was always if he painted, he had to clear up or someone had to clear up. That space couldn't be kept as a studio for too long. Well, so the gallery could take the luxury of indulging in that. And for us also, it was fun because we could watch him.
I mean, when he'd come and he'd paint at the gallery sometimes, he'd paint and he'd use the floor to mix colors, And Baliram, who I mentioned, who used to work with us, he would be like, look at the floor, madam, floor. I'm like, it's okay, relax, it will come off, So, but, they were wonderful times.
It all depended on his mood on that day. If he just wanted to be difficult, he could be very demanding, and otherwise could be hugely accommodating. So if you said, oh, he wanted, let's say, a middle yellow, and you didn't have a middle yellow there, acha, theek hai, main kuch aur kar leta hu and mix some color. But on a day that he wanted to be difficult, he wanted that color there and then. So it was, as I said, it all depended on his mood. And he was totally oblivious to people around. He could tune off, which was something so amazing about him.
He was so focused when he painted. Nothing, sound, people, whatever chaos was happening around him. Nothing distracted him from what he was doing.
There was just no distraction for him. You could be talking, you could be shouting, you could be... In fact, he liked background sound. He always liked background sound around him because he came from an environment which was high density of population. There was always sound around him. Now, this is a story that I've heard secondhand, not something I experienced. But early one evening, it must have been around 4 or 5, that Husain drove straight to the gallery from the airport. And he was super excited because after years, he had gone back to the National Museum in Madras. And he had been hugely inspired by the Chola bronzes that he had seen. And he told my dad, I really want to get all that out of me. I've just been there yesterday and it's bothering me. But he said, I can't think of a material I want to use to express that. So he told my dad, let's walk into the market and see what we can find. So they both went down Crawford Market, then onward to Muhammad Ali Road, walking streets, and he just couldn't see a material that suited him. Till he saw these bolts of burlap, which is basically jute, woven jute in bolts. And he said, this is what I want. And they bought whatever amount of fabric. And next he went and bought black enamel paint, double-boiled linseed oil, turpentine, and they went back to the gallery. And he painted through the night. He started there and then once they were back. And my dad would just keep opening the fabric and he would do these sort of drawings in black enamel paint. And then just keep pulling it out till it dried, till you could roll it back. But enamel paint dries reasonably quick. And, the jute being unprimed, it absorbed quite a bit. So and he just finished that entire exhibition by 6 a.m. the next morning. The whole exhibition was ready. And it was just painted continuously with just gaps in the middle for my dad to cut and stretch. But the public weren't so enthusiastic about that because the exhibition got a pretty lukewarm response. He couldn't translate it. Today, if you look back at that, I can assure you all those people would say, oh my God, I was so stupid. But at that time, like, oh, what is this? But Husain had done it to complete commitment that I know. It wasn't anything gimmicky. He had taken the effort to find the material to express what he wanted to say. It wasn't something done just for the sake of being different. I mean, Husain had a sense of discipline in him. And on a certain day when he decided he was going to paint, it was like, I'm going to paint. And he sat down on the stool, which we had propped up at the gallery as a studio. And I was standing beside him. He turned around, kya banao? And I said, but who am I to dictate to you what to say? Arey, kuch to bolo na. If I don't like it, I'll dismiss it. But sometimes an idea helps.
He had pockets. He always wore a waistcoat and he had these pockets that were always bulging with stuff. We never knew what was in it or what would come out of it. But he had these little things that he'd write and he'd put it in the pocket. And he had an order in his head. So he put it in that right order in his pocket, And then he'd sometimes, like when he'd be painting at the gallery, he would hunt around all his pockets. And then he'd find that paper and he'd look at it and then I never knew what was in it. But then he'd start painting. So I don't know what the connection was. Maybe he had made notes.
He says, do you know, when I was younger as a painter, and I'd be traveling, I had always a little notebook in my pocket. And any thought that crossed my mind, I would write it down. And he said I would make a whole list of subjects I wanted to tackle. So it may be marketplace, it could be farmer's family, it could be anything. I just note down the idea. And then when I would sit down to paint, I would take out that little paper and go through it and decide what I wanted to paint that day. So he said, this is a practice that I've had. It's not that you're telling me what to paint. You're just giving me an idea, a seed. You're putting a seed in. Then you're not telling me what to make. So he said, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. And that was something I also learned from Badri later. When one day we were sitting at the gallery, it was summer. And I said, hey, Badri, this year there are no watermelon sellers yet. So he said, oh my God, because every summer the watermelon sellers, I guess the city was also changing. And they stopped coming, visiting Chembur where he lived. And he did a painting and then he said, thanks to my friend Dadiba Pundole that I remembered to do a watermelon seller. So I don't think I was under some impression that an artist shouldn't be told what to paint. But that's not necessarily true. So, after painting his car, I think there must have been certain he was certainly his own master. But I'm sure when it came to domestic affairs, his wife did have some say. So she was a lovely, lovely woman. And I think without her, he wouldn't have been what he was. Because she took care of the home and left him free to paint. But I think after painting his car, I think next he wanted to paint the interiors of his home. And he did. It was basically white walls with black drawing. And he painted the whole sitting room, the walls, the ceiling. It was images sort of crawling and climbing. And it was quite an experience when you first saw it. And that stayed for many, many years till I think the house was sort of renovated. And finally, that drawing had aged and finally had to be obliterated. And I think he got also an opportunity with someone like Parmeshwar Godrej when she was doing the Khyber restaurant. I remember he had painted on the ceiling there and, so it was something that he genuinely believed and wanted to, and which he took forward when he did even his Gufa in Ahmedabad. He had the walls and the ceiling painted, the interior, like paintings on the walls. So the logo came in 1964 and he told my dad, "Tere liye ghoda acha rahega." My dad didn't know whether to take that as a compliment or as something negative. So he just I don't know exactly the reaction. And then he went on to explain that a horse is a loyal animal. So, certain virtues of the horse. And then Dad, I think, got a little calmer about it. And that's when he designed the horse for Dad as a logo. So this was when the news of the Gulf War broke out, the Kuwait invasion of Iraq, and then the subsequent war. The gallery was redone in 1989-90. And the architect had designed this very sort of stark white facade with just square Kent tiles. And I used to always joke with Husain and several other people that right across the road at HSBC outside that there was a urinal, and that was a white block. And I used to always joke with people and ask them that, does my gallery exterior look like match that? And I must have mentioned this to Husain, which he didn't comment on. And he said, oh, it looks perfectly fine. And it was the day when this news broke out that he came quite agitated to the gallery and asked for black acrylic paint. And I remember we had it in tubes. And he said, no, I don't need it in tubes. I want it in a tub. And I didn't know what he wanted this for. So anyway, at Fountain, there were enough stationery stores at the back, managed to get a tub of camel acrylic paint. And with that long brush that he used to carry, he'd sort of dipped into it and drew the drawing on that wall. And it was also a sense of him bringing out his anger, his frustration, and at the same time, solving a problem that I had in my head. So I think it was mutually beneficial. So when he finished painting the exterior of the gallery, he gave me the brush with which he had painted it, and that's something I've always kept with me. But he had this fascination for these long brushes, which were only available in Paris. And he had stopped going to Paris that often. So every time he went, he'd remind me, please get me a brush. And that's something I did every time I went to Paris, there was one store where you'd get these long brushes, and the store owner had got to know me over the years with annual visits. And she used to be most fascinated why I'd buy 2-3 of these brushes. And she said, I only buy them and keep them because you'll come. Because I don't think they were very fashionable then. But he loved his long brush, which he always carried beside him. 83, when we completed 20 years of Husain's and Dad's association, he designed an entire publication, which was also called Story of a Brush, where he sort of chronicled the association of the gallery from 63 to 83, and different exhibitions, different periods of how the two had sort of moved hand in hand. I'm not very clear how the conversation went, but I think Dad requested Husain for an exhibition on the 25th anniversary of the gallery on 3rd May 1988. And Husain, as usual, thought of something different. And he always felt in India, graphics weren't taken quite seriously. Whilst the West had such a strong old tradition of printmaking. And he said, okay, let's do an exhibition. I'll do a suite of prints for the gallery. So there were a group of lithographs and serigraphs. And this was the kind of catalogue to it, which had sort of illustrations to the various prints that he had done. And for that, he came to the gallery on the opening on the 3rd morning that I remember, with a large bottle of whiskey, and gave it to my dad as a gift. And then he told him, open it. And my dad said, no, I don't intend opening it. So he said, no, open it. And when Dad opened the lid of the box, he had inscribed it there to Freni and Kali on 25 years of the gallery. Much love, Husain. I don't quite remember the words, but I have the bottle. And Dad never used the bottle. It stayed in his cupboard. And when Dad passed away, I said, why did Dad? We should have drunk this whiskey. It was meant to be drunk. That's why Husain gave it. But even I still haven't. So it remains as it is.
When they had the exhibition that was the 25th anniversary of the Pundole Gallery, I think that was when I really interacted with him for the first time, because everybody was so excited and it was the 25th anniversary of the gallery. So we all wanted autographs on our brochures and things like that. So that was one of the few things that I remember of my first memories of the gallery in that sense. He was a very gentle person, I have to say. And he never, he was a very fine human being. I never seen him lose his cool with anybody. He was just nice and pleasant. He loved meeting people. It could be anybody. People from the street would walk into the gallery when he was painting, and when he'd get up for a break, they would still be there. They'd all want to, talk to him and, be around him and touch him. And he never stopped them. Zero attitude, absolutely zero attitude, which is rare in today's world. So he came to the gallery, and it was post-lunch, so it must have been around 3-ish. And he was quite not disturbed, but a little rattled kind of thing. So what happened? And he says, I went for lunch and I met this person, and she kept insisting that I do a portrait of her. She kept obviously insisting that he do her portrait. And he kept saying no or trying to avoid it politely. But finally, she made him do the portrait, I went in to order tea. I said, maybe next time, when you're here, I'll tell you, I'll pester you, and then you'll do my portrait also. And then I went inside at the back of the gallery to the pantry to get tea for all of us. When I come back, he's done my portrait. I said, this is for you. I'm like, this is really embarrassed because that was not my intention. And I said, no. And he said, no, but it's for you. It's you. So it's for you. So I was quite I mean, I was very touched, and I was also very, very embarrassed, I have to say, because that was not my intention at all.
He did speak about his childhood quite often, but it was anecdotal. It was never sort of linear that at this age, this. It was always anecdotal. And then one fine day he told me, "Chalo, let's go to Indore." And I was super excited about it. And we went just for the day to Indore, but it was a lovely experience. He showed me his school. He showed me the big tree under which his grandfather would bring him his lunch and he'd sit and eat. He took me to his stepsister's home. He showed me the Duldul horse, which they used to keep every year in storage and decorated just before the Moram procession. And he remembered everything vividly. And I think visiting that was, for me, one of the highlights of traveling with Husain. Once both of us happened to be in Hyderabad. He was staying at a friend's home and I was staying at the Green Park Hotel. I get a call from the reception. One Mr. Husain is waiting down here for you. He had taken his host's car and decided to drive it to the hotel. So I said, "What are you doing?" "Chalo, let's go for breakfast." And we stopped outside this small Irani restaurant, small cafe. He called the waiter and he said, "Ek anda aur pav." So we got this little metal plate put with one fried egg in it and a bread each. And we both dug in and shared it. So Husain had to be very frugal in his early years. And I think, I could be wrong, but if I remember him telling me, it was at the birth of Shafat, when Shafat was a little baby. He went and rented a cradle for 24 hours. And he brought that home. He placed Shafat in it and had his wife Fazila Begum sitting there, attending to daily chores and rocking the cradle. And he furiously sort of did drawings, including one painting, which is in the public domain, with that cradle as the prop. Everything in the whole room that he lived in centered around that cradle. And I've got one lovely drawing which is titled The Cradle. There was this very well-known play by Vijay Tendulkar, which was quite a revolutionary play when it was written. It's in Marathi and very critical of the political situation in Maharashtra under Peshwa rule. And it was a long-running play, and Husain revisited it after several years in 1989 when it was again redone in Bombay. And that inspired him to pay tribute to Tendulkar by doing a series of works based on the play, images. It had very strong visual imagery. It had two sides. People were very critical of the way Tendulkar treated his subject and the way he treated the sets. It had controversy on both sides. And when these whole series of watercolors and inks were done, they were framed. And Husain one day came to the gallery and said, "Tum isko diwal pe laga lo." So I said, "Any particular?" He said, "No, I want them to be absolutely random." So I still didn't get it. So he said, "Just put them as you like. One can be up, one can be down. I don't want them in a line. I don't want them linear for sure." So I said, "How far can I go?" So he said, "The floor and the ceiling are your limits." And I did the best I could. It looked a little awkward to me, but I said, "Well, this is as creative as I can get." And he came in the next day, looked around, said, "Perfect." Took a box of raw umber, took his long brush again, the box on the floor, he'd keep dipping it in, and he connected all the paintings with these drawings, which is the opening scene of the play, where there are these Brahmin Pandits, each one facing the audience and the other facing his back alternately. And he just so beautifully sort of connected all these little frames and made it one homogeneous work. By 89, and this has happened right through Husain's career, critics, even artist friends, have written him off and said, Husain's got nothing more to say. And this was one instance, the 89 exhibition, where it took everyone by surprise and said, "Yeah, we are wrong." Including the well-known critic Ranjit Hoskote, who till then had been quite critical of Husain, but his review in the Times of India of that exhibition changes his view on the painter.
I feel that I was really, really fortunate to have met him because, we didn't realize their importance in terms of history, and they were history makers of our times. And I think that I mean, I'm fortunate to have met Dadiba, and through that have met Husain.
So one evening late in 2003, Husain walked into the gallery, sat down on the chair and said, I've been thinking that having been born in 1913, I've almost lived through the entire 20th century. And I want to sort of document key moments or memories that I have of that century in painting. And he wanted to use the gallery as a studio space for this mega project. And he started working on it. So we'd stretched out 2 large blank white canvases on the 2 larger walls of the gallery. Promptly at 9 o'clock, we had an appointment the next morning, and he was there before me. And he started working on these drawings. But typical of Husain that, I had to cancel an exhibition which the artist had kindly agreed to, which was fine. But this project just would go on because he'd disappear for a week, 10 days, then come back again, start working. And then I think he could sense my anxiety of this taking too long. And then he decided to shift the whole project to Dubai. A friend of his offered him a vacant space there. And he wanted it in the old part of the city because that's where he felt more sort of in touch with reality. How strange that these 25 works were never really shown in Bombay. And now they're being exhibited here in this, where the whole entire body has come back to us for sale. So in a way, it's a complete circle now.